Hi, welcome to Bottom Line with Bob and Kendel Ehrlich. Today we're going to be talking about D-Day, annual giving. Senator Manchin is in the news, as well as, what else? Immigration. Probably get started on D-Day, which I know is important. We've been very fortunate. We were there at the 60th anniversary of the celebration of the invasion, and it was just one of those lifetime experiences that you'll never forget. We both recommend that if anybody has not been to Normandy and gets the chance to please visit that hallowed ground, because it is life-changing.
We were there during the 60th anniversary as First Lady and Governor, celebrating Maryland's 29th Division, 60th anniversary. And we were there for 2 days. The day before the celebration, we were there at dusk. And the choirs were singing, the sun was setting.
It was amazing.
And it was such a serene environment. It was peaceful. Walking through the graves, it was unimaginable what had occurred there 60 years prior. But it was probably the most interesting, wonderful, memorable day of our tenure as Governor and First Lady. Would you agree?
Oh, one of the best days of our lives.
Yes, absolutely.
It's just really amazing.
No doubt about it. So I put a tweet out the other day, which you liked. You usually like my tweets. And it was to the effect that it wasn't about all of D-Day, but obviously it's appropriate to celebrate all of D-Day, all the troops, the importance of that day, but about the Rangers, the couple hundred Rangers, Army Rangers who scaled the heights at Pointe du Hoc. Mm-hmm. And we were there.
Yes.
We were there. These were kids. By the way, those Army Rangers suffered 70% casualty rate, both killed and wounded that day. They're the brave, incredibly brave young soldiers who scaled those cliffs in the face of automatic fire from the Germans. It was an absolutely vital role to play to get top of those cliffs to start clearing the way for the secondary invasion. What they did, the bravery, and so I just threw a tweet out to the effect that just take 5 minutes today and tell your kid about this. Teach your kid about what those guys did to save the world, literally.
And how important history is. Real history.
American history.
Right.
Gallant, heroic American history. Now, in a famous speech in 1984, 40 years, President Reagan honored the boys of Pointe du Hoc. Mm-hmm. And that was the title of the speech. But the best Reagan quote concerning not just D-Day, but the American history generally. I love this quote. Baby, you've heard me use this time and time again. It's classic Reagan because it's quick. It's not overly intellectual. Anybody can understand it, but it's so deep. If we forget what we did, we won't know who we are. If we forget D-Day, we will not know what we did, what those sons did, those fathers did. Most were not fathers. They were kids.
Sons,
they were
right.
kids. They were kids. So when you see this woke stuff going around,
when you see statues being taken down, people of history.
Yeah. When you see the damage that's being inflicted on American history by the woke crowd, remember this. Now, we're not going to get into this in great detail today, but we stand for teaching American history, warts and all.
Exactly.
We're not talking about some idealized version that America was always right, America was always heroic, America didn't have slavery. We're not saying any of that stuff. We have warts and all. You teach both sides of the greatest experiment in human history. So first point there. Second, going to what appears to be a way more mundane matter, but something really important, again, with respect to education and institutions, what schools are doing, colleges, universities, private schools these days.
Which is a battleground.
Well, it is the next cultural battleground.
And civil rights battleground.
The next front of the culture wars. In fact, it started. We're starting now. We're engaging. Our side's engaging. This is very personal to us. You went to a public high school, obviously, but you get contributions from your law school. We get contributions from the schools our kids attended, a couple private schools. I was able to attend a scholarship at a private high school and then a private college and law school as well. We hear from a lot of schools. We get a lot of, can you spend a few bucks? Can you send a few dollars to our annual giving cause? And you know what? For the most part, we're saying no. We're saying no, and we're asking not just we're living the talk. So everybody should know we are living our instruction to you and us, that to the extent these schools have gone woke, to the extent universities no longer have conservative professors, or they want to limit the First Amendment on campus, or they shout down conservative speakers, or they withdraw invitations to conservative speakers, or they generate huge security bills to discourage conservative speakers from coming on campus. No more. We're not playing. We're not playing. I'm not playing with Princeton University, my college. I'm not playing with Gilman School, my high school. Enough. Now, we're not saying, by the way, that Marx and Lenin and Marxism and progressivism and liberalism shouldn't be taught.
But so should the other side.
So should the other side, right? So should free market economists be heard. So should socially conservative speakers be heard. Enough.
And of all places, the college campus should be about what they did in the 60s, which was speech, all speech.
So the best way to get their attention, we can protest, we can write letters and emails, and we've done this for years, as many others have, and they just shrug. The way to hit them is at the pocketbook. And by the way, we've already seen some, particularly with regard to my high school and my college, some response, because when they start hurting with annual giving, they may actually start listening to 25, 45, 55% of their graduates who do not share the new woke agenda on campus.
Let me just also add that for those who are listening who are in positions of leaderships on boards, governance is really an important aspect of this as well. Losing sight of who is on your board and the purpose of a board is very important in this too.
Boy, because we've lived it.
The wokeness is also permeating all of these boards, and losing control of the numbers on a board, losing control of the direction of a board can happen very quickly if you don't have a real purpose to where your organization is headed, whether it be for-profit, nonprofit. It is very important to recognize who should be on your board. So for those of you in leadership positions, please pay attention to this. It's just like we're asking people to now pay attention to the school board elections.
Yep.
Governance is incredibly important, and we've let it get away for a long time. The more the merrier is not always the case on a board. Think about in real life. If you have 20 people in a room, what can you get done? Not much. And I don't mean to say that in a cynical way, or maybe I do mean to say it in a cynical way, but really recognize where you want your organization to go, what it takes to get there, and to not cloud the issues and just put the more the merrier on a board just for the sake of doing that.
And understand when that institution is under threat. Understand when you're about to lose the culture of that institution.
Right. And it certainly, if you want to lose that culture, that might
Correct.
be one thing.
Correct.
But if you want to maintain a certain culture, and that doesn't mean changing with the times or staying in the 1950s when you're in the 2000s, that's not what that means. That just means a certain culture, a certain respect, certain qualities. Certain balance,
certain
qualifications. And certainly balance is incredibly important when you're talking about education. It is speech of all sides, not just one side and not just one influence.
Speaking of balance, Joe Manchin. We have dubbed him, as others have, the most powerful person
in the world
on earth. And he's proving it again this week. He came out against H.R. 1. Thankfully.
From our perspective.
And you know what? I've studied this guy. I've known very well at least one candidate ran against him. He is a moderate. He really is a moderate. And I know the Biden administration is trying to suck up to him on certain issues, and Republicans try to suck up to him. I mean, it's a very difficult place to play, the middle of the road. What do they say? What's in the middle of the road? Basically dead animals, right? Or dead politicians. And this guy, representing a conservative, strongly Trump state, used to be a Democratic conservative state, now a Republican conservative state. He's walking a tightrope every day, but fortunately for the country, the federalization of our voting laws will not occur. Now, you and I both as lawyers thought this bill would have trouble in the courts.
Right.
But politically, it may be dead, which is a good thing for our democracy.
Interesting. I mean, he really is the last conservative Democrat or moderate Democrat. Let's say moderate Democrat, right? Left.
Well,
certainly in the Senate.
Yeah,
is there anybody left in the House?
Yes, the Democrat from Arizona as well. Cinema. She's also moderate. But his rationale here was really interesting. It was, how can you do this? He's talking to the Democratic majority, by the way. How can you do this? How can you fundamentally change the voting system of the United States of America and not have the Republicans take part? How could the major other party? This was a bill that passed the House by 10 votes. It was a pure party line vote in the House. Not one Republican supported H.R. 1. So his ground here, his rationale, his foundation, in my view, makes a lot of sense.
Sure does. And thank you, Senator Manchin.
Thank you, Senator Manchin, for that. And wow, he lives a tough life. He lives a tough life. So, by the way, the far left, the progressive left, they're just going after him, as you would expect. So hold strong, Senator.
He understands that they were going to do that too.
He does. So this week we want to get into the first of a couple shows on immigration. We're devoting time to immigration because, in our view right now, at this point, it's the most important issue in our country because of what's happening at the southern border, the absolute chaos, the absolute out-of-control result that followed at least interpreted as a general invitation to come to the border by the Biden administration. Stay in Mexico has now been officially repealed by this administration. So we have a number of related stories, and next week we're going to have a terrific guest talking about this, someone who knows an awful lot about this issue. But for Kendel Ehrlich, first issue is concerning immigration. Instruction from the Biden administration to their attorneys at immigration that the guidance would be to look for ways not to prosecute illegal immigration. Basically, sending the message out that the enforcement part of ICE is no longer.
So we have no immigration law at all, basically.
Well, they would be narrowing the zone, you would say.
Oh, please.
Clearly. So that's really the first. And by the way, the theory here is really interesting and weird in my view, and this comes from the administration. They're proceeding upon the assumption that less cases will result in more respect for the law.
That is the most backward thinking I have ever heard in my life.
Well, here's the rationale. We have too many cases. We can't the system's overwhelmed. And by the way, why is the system overwhelmed? Because they invited this syndrome to occur after the election. If Trump did it, they undid it, as we've talked about in the past. So here we go with too many cases. So let's narrow.
So they created the problem, and then they come back with a far left view of not complying with the law, which is really an overall view of lawlessness.
Yeah.
Which is really what I think is the number one issue. Immigration's part of it. But it's a larger issue of lawlessness completely, which ends in chaos.
Always. As you see, by the way, and we're not going to do this every week. We could do this literally every week. We could start the show and go halfway or all the way through the show with just the crime statistics from Minneapolis, from Chicago, from New York, from LA, from Baltimore, because they're dramatic. It's almost always a murder rate, violent crime rate, just skyrocketing as a result of defund policies. And by the way, most of the time, almost all the time, the victims are folks who live in the community, a lot of minority victims, a lot of kids. Nobody talks about these kids. Nobody stands up for these kids. Sometimes you'll see on Fox News folks from the neighborhood screaming bloody murder.
Right.
We want more cops. We want more protection.
More police,
right? We want more police. The police are our friends. Please, more police.
But recently, one of these woke cities said that they're not even going to prosecute thefts. So that's just an opportunity. Come on into my store and steal whatever you want. You don't have to pay for it. I mean, our system breaks down when we don't prosecute these laws. We have these laws for a reason. Property is part of the Constitution too, property rights, and businesses that would say, oh, just come in and loot my store. That is just an absurd way to operate, and it's very frightening. And I don't know where those cities end up. I think they do end up in chaos. I think that a lot of people are moving out of those cities. And then, of course, you have the reaction to that backlash saying, oh, well, we didn't realize that that's what was going to happen. And that's why people are leaving, the Portlands and the Minneapolises and all of these cities that you just named. And that's my concern, that it's getting even worse. It's not just marijuana legalizing. Now it's other drugs in various cities in California. Then it's the theft statute. Where does that end?
Well, I'm glad you asked me an open-ended question because, as you see, we're going to talk about immigration and crime and punishment, how they relate for the next really remainder of this show and next show. And the second issue under this category is something that you are an expert in, sex offenders. Because the headline this week was sex offenders surge across U.S. border from the Washington Times. An alarming number of migrant sex offenders are being nabbed. The president of the National Border Patrol, quote, more people are rushing the border, and more of them are sex offenders. Some are solo, some are part of large groups that come across the border. And guess who is in those large groups? Kids.
They say that human trafficking is growing at a rate worse than the drug market. And that is, when you think about it, really alarming to think that people are still, in this day and age, in America, taking advantage of our most vulnerable children, many of whom now are just coming solo over the border, being taken advantage of both before they get to the border and after they get to the border. You know that this means so much to me. I was the former director of SMART, which is the Sentencing, Monitoring, Apprehending, Registration, and Tracking of Sex Offenders. It's the federal sex offender unit to make sure states are compliant with a federal law and get a certain amount of money based on that.
And you were the director of that
And I was the director of that operation. And let me just say to you that I have no idea, the people that worked in that area, what their politics were, really. I was a political appointee, so they knew mine. But I have to say to you, everyone in that office felt very strongly for victims, and they recognized that in the country, even before we got to this state, which is extreme right now, it was trending to take away registering sex offenders in lots of states and communities. And that is really a problem because neighborhoods, communities have a right to know when a sex offender is entering their community for the protection of the children in that community. And I mean children, young children that are playing in your community, going to school in your community. They have the right to be protected. And it just seems that in all of this, the victims of crime are really getting forgotten all across the board.
Well, let's talk about the future victims that will be occurring as a result of this policy, because they're coming over the border in larger numbers. And the numbers reflect it. Again, another aspect, something that we've talked a lot about, you've worked in for many years, the criminal justice system, gang affiliation. And the Biden administration, Homeland Security, is moving to cut questions about gang affiliation from green card applications. Now think about that. The Trump administration added those questions because that's a fairly relevant bit of information. You would think that America, the American taxpayer, the American government deserves to know when someone's filling out a green card application. Well, they have a gang affiliation. Well, guess what, folks?
They're not even going to ask the question. I mean, you're going to say probably people don't always tell the truth in answering that question, and that's probably
sometimes
true.
They do, though.
But sometimes they do, and to take away the question would be to take away any fear whatsoever about that question or about whether you're a gang affiliate. And let me just say that the gang, shootings that occur in all these cities, initiations, it is horrific what they do, how they think, and we're just opening that border and letting them in to your neighborhood. You should be alarmed, very alarmed, because the organizations already exist in our communities. Many times we don't know about it, don't hear about it, but now it's even worse.
And of course, I just saw this story literally coming up the steps before we came up to start the show. A story, I believe this was in the Washington Times again. If not, I'll correct myself next show. But the number of dangerous weapons, semi-automatic, fully automatic weapons being confiscated has increased as well because the gangs use them. Particularly the narco gangs. The narco gangs use them, and you're an expert in the narco gangs. And the narco gangs are being empowered at this time.
Of course they are. Oh, the cartels are in full business.
Which brings me to
they are in full business right over that border.
Which brings me to our last topic for this show.
They walk the people and the drugs across the border.
Speaking of the drugs, if there's one drug that my wife talks about constantly, now you were also. Tell everybody what you were in a past life, not so past ago, about a year and a half ago. You were deputy drug czar for this country.
I was the deputy drug czar, and before that, I was the prosecutor of a drug court here in Annapolis. And we did lots of great work, but particularly focusing on the drug you're going to mention.
So a lot of average Americans maybe hear about this drug, but they have no experience with it. They know cocaine, they know heroin, they've heard pot and all this.
They heard it with Michael Jackson.
Fentanyl. What you've told me from the jump, the most dangerous drug you ever saw, the most dangerous drug, prosecutors, doctors, one small microscopic hit, you're dead. So the news item for this week is more fentanyl seized by Border Patrol so far in 2021. We're not halfway through. Than the entirety of 2020. And so we're talking about already this year, 6,494 pounds compared to 4,776 pounds this time last year. And a number of physicians have been quoted along the lines of they can't even comprehend what that amount of fentanyl on the streets means in terms of new deaths in America.
So there's a show on Netflix called Dope, and they visit several cities and do sort of an in-depth look at Chicago, Baltimore, I think Detroit, and I can't remember the other. But please view the Baltimore one. There's a drug dealer that they interview talking about fentanyl and what it means to the industry, and they show two addicts on there. If you really want to see what that looks like up close and personal, it's alarming. And let me just say this. I've often said that I think every family in America has been affected by two things. One is cancer and the other is addiction. And fentanyl is a whole new game because they say one and done. So if your college child is taking a pill that is stamped Xanax or Adderall or something else, and then it's laced with fentanyl, they'll be dead. And that has happened time and time again. And the pain in these families of losing a young life. This year, we are pushing over 80,000 deaths from fentanyl, largely from fentanyl, addiction deaths. We were getting some control on it. President Trump had put more money toward the issue than anybody else previously. On both the supply aspect.
Can I stop there for the supply? Because you had told me in the past it's coming from China. It's still coming from China in many cases, not all cases. But now the southern border is a hot spot for fentanyl, yeah. And it never used to be the case, right?
They were doing a lot of mail work. Now it's all coming through the border. And we're not even talking about the methamphetamine, which is not on the coast as much, but it just ravishes the middle America, just ravishes it. And the methamphetamine is also now coming through the border. Drug cartels involved in all of this and all of the distribution. It's got to stop. And the way the Biden administration is handling this border, it's only going to get worse, families are going to lose more loved ones, more devastation. I just can't emphasize it enough that for me, the border issue is all about the trafficking and about the drugs.
Which is why we're talking about crime and punishment
and
here.
And continued crime.
Well, that's just a taste of what's happening with regard to our border enforcement, the chaos, which is now status quo at our southern border. This is not a red or blue issue. You see elections now being flipped on the border, by the way, with Hispanic Democrats voting Republican, saying, and we didn't vote for this. This is not part of our American dream. Chaos at the border is not part of the American dream.
And I predict crime, like it has in the past been the driver of an election. I predict that crime in 2022 and 2024.
Well, Republicans have flipped a couple mayor races down there. These are Hispanic, by the way, Hispanic Democrats who single digits voted for President Trump in 2016, and in well into the double digits voted for him as a result of this issue, by the way, this issue being the primary issue. So we're going to talk next week more about the border and crime and punishment and the myriad of issues that have been brought to the forefront of American politics by the decision of a new administration to simply rebut, delete, do the opposite of, whatever term you want to use, preempt the policies of the previous administration. As we said on this show, the Trump administration wasn't perfect by a long shot. But during the middle of his term, the president and his administration and ICE got control of that border with stay in Mexico. And now, again, that policy has been deleted. So here we go. Next week, a special guest, special friend, a lot of interesting stuff to come. And thanks for listening, folks.
So please follow us on Twitter at Earl Bottomline, at Bob_Ehrlich, and at Kendel Ehrlich. Also, give us an email. Let us know what you're thinking at ehrlichbottomline@gmail.com. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Godspeed.